Welcome to the Both Lives podcast, where we talk about pregnancy, human dignity, and the value of every life before and after birth. We are pro-women and pro-life because both lives matter. My guest today is Professor John Wyatt, and a proper introduction and bio will be in the show notes. So we're just going to jump straight into the podcast recording. John, thank you for joining us. And if I didn't know who you were, pretend, how would you introduce yourself to me?
Hello, Dawn. It's lovely to be here. Well, the short version is I describe myself as a baby doctor. I spent many years working, the technical word is as a neonatologist, a medical doctor specialising in care of newborn babies. And I worked in a big intensive care unit in central London. And I went into the area because I loved babies, and it was a very exciting and new form of medical care. And it was really only when I was in there that I increasingly realised that this was a huge ethical jungle and maelstrom. And so increasingly then I focused on issues to do with medical ethics and issues both at the beginning and end of life.
So we're probably, I suspect, going to delve into every aspect of that to some degree. What year did you begin medicine?
Gosh, this is ancient history. So I went to university in 1971. Actually, to read physics. I was wanting to be a scientist. I was a distinctly nerdish interests, and my idea was to become an astronomer or a cosmologist and understand about the universe. But while in my first year at university, I had a kind of spiritual crisis about my life and about the purpose of existence and all the rest. And it was really at that point that my Christian faith came alive. And shortly afterwards, much to my surprise, there was this very strong sense of a call to give up physics and to turn to medicine. And so I started training in medicine in 1972, and I qualified in 1978, and which is a very long time ago. It was still in the relatively early days of the NHS. I worked at St Thomas's Hospital in South London. I can still remember working as a junior doctor, many of particularly the older people coming from Lambeth and so on, and saying things like, "Oh, doctor, it's just so wonderful to have this free treatment, and I feel it's just so amazing. I'm so grateful for what is being provided for me."
Do you know, it's funny that you say that. I, like many people, probably have loved watching Call the Midwife, and we've I hadn't actually thought about that where we've got to in this series, which is the early 70s, I suppose, is what you're talking about, and that living memory of not having the NHS and what we all maybe take for granted now. I hadn't actually appreciated that you can speak to that yourself, John. And the other thing I hadn't realised, but now it makes maybe more sense, your interest in physics, cosmology, because that's in your own podcast, Matters of Life and Death, you do go into sort of some of that aspect of science, and I didn't understand that was your background. So it makes a bit more sense now. But I want to go back to what you said about being a baby doctor. You comment that it was quite a new field. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so historically, looking after babies wasn't something that paediatricians thought was important. It may seem bizarre to us now, but actually paediatricians focused on sick children, and newborn babies were actually the responsibility of obstetricians. The doctors who delivered the mother also had a responsibility for the newborn babies, as did midwives. But perhaps not surprisingly, the whole focus was on the mother, and the baby tended to be neglected. And there were very high rates of infant mortality. Babies would die frequently either at birth because they couldn't be resuscitated, or they would die in the first few days of life. And so the development of neonatal medicine, of a form of medicine that was specialised just to care for newborn babies, really only started in the 1960s, and I entered the field in the 1980s, early 1980s, when it was still a very new discipline, and it was very much based on research. But to quite a large extent, I remember the feeling at the time that we were often making it up as we went along. I mean, there were no textbooks that were relevant. There was very little background information. We were pushing the limits, trying to use the new technology, trying to work out what it was possible to keep babies alive, and how to do it all. And in my lifetime, I've seen it completely change. Now it's become a very mainstream part of paediatrics and medical care, and there are huge textbooks and guidelines and so on. So it's fascinating for me to see that whole progression, how it evolves.
It's hard for me to imagine a time when there wasn't such a thing as you've just said. The context of pregnancy, we always talk about both lives in pregnancy. So how you've just described, maybe the doctor, the obstetrics caring for the woman in pregnancy, the birth, baby's born, but then baby isn't the priority even then. That's quite striking. The development of being a baby doctor, and that area of medicine, the technological advancements must have been huge. Are there any particular examples of a family? There must have been so many mummies and babies, but is there anything that really stands out that maybe speaks to, in some way, the development that we've been talking about, either in practice or the technological advancements?
Well, yes, indeed. And again, the fascinating thing about the whole work as a baby doctor, as a neonatologist, is that it has these two very different aspects. It has a very technical, scientific aspect. The big advances that have been made in neonatal care have been based on sophisticated medical research and the application of a really better understanding that a baby is actually not just a miniature adult. A baby is a very different kind of organism and therefore needs very specialized kind of care. But at the same time, there is a very, well, I often call it touchy-feely kind of aspect of recognizing the extraordinary emotions and the tenderness of caring for a baby, but also the terrible poignancy of a baby who's sick or a baby who's dying. It's interesting that over the years I must have cared for many thousands of babies. I worked in this field for nearly 30 years. But as I look back now, having retired, it's often the dying babies which stand out in my memory. I've forgotten most of the ones that got better, but there was a special poignancy, but also a privilege of caring for parents and a baby. And I became one of the people who really pioneered the idea of palliative care for babies. So I felt we could take the same kind of principles that have been developed by doctors like Cicely Saunders and others for caring for adults, and then adapt the same principles now for caring for a newborn baby that was dying.
Did you have to really fight for that, argue for that, defend that? Did other people think it wasn't worth doing, or?
Yeah, to some extent, yes. Certainly, I think quite a lot of my colleagues thought it was unnecessary, and that we should focus on the living and on the babies that had a chance, and that if the baby was going to die, then there was nothing we could do and we should move on. Whereas I felt very strongly that every life was precious, and that it was to allow a baby to die in his or her mother's arms, pain-free, at peace, with the right support and care, that could be as much a triumph of neonatal care as sending the baby home as a great success. You know, that we couldn't make every baby better, but we could provide compassionate and sophisticated and human-centered care for every baby and for their family.
Do you think what you as a baby doctor, a neonatologist, brings to the table when decisions are being made is even from a scientific perspective, an understanding of the life and the dignity of that little person that maybe other fields of medicine don't have the same understanding or respect for?
Yes, I do think there is this different perspective as a neonatologist, and quite often we've had sort of dialogues with obstetricians, with other doctors and so on. It is still the case, and understandably, the obstetrician, the doctor who's caring for the mother, will always tend to prioritise the mother's life. And if that means jeopardising the life of the baby, well, so be it. I mean, our first priority is to protect the mother. And sometimes they felt, you know, why were we spending all these resources on trying to ensure that a tiny premature baby, maybe born 3 months early, trying to ensure that life survives? I mean, surely it would be much better to just say, well, look, clearly this baby is a no-hoper, and tell the parents to go and have another one, sort of, we put it rather crudely. And as a neonatologist, I was quite often in the position of trying to defend the value and the significance of even this tiny little scrap, and say that this life is precious, and we demonstrate that by our concern and by protecting the interests of this little scrap.
And when you say maybe within obstetrics, the primary patient is the woman, you talked about protecting, I think protecting was the word you used, her life. But of course, so often it's not that the mummy's life is literally life and death. There's not a life and death issue. There's maybe the sense of her well-being or future well-being. Have there been areas of tension where obviously you're working with colleagues, there's respect, there's professional respect, but is there an example maybe that you can pinpoint where there was a good outcome in that then there was respect all around? You maybe had to argue a case, but how you were viewing that little life, maybe there was a recognition that it was a good decision that you'd argued for?
Yes, I can think of a number of cases when the medical opinion was that it would be much better just to effectively abandon the unborn baby as being of no significance. And one of the fascinating things that I saw many times was that whereas medically the obstetricians their default position was, if there's any kind of conflict between the mother and the baby, we always put the mother first. Whereas very often the mother's own instincts were very different. Mm-hmm. And I saw time and again that mothers were actually prepared to jeopardize their own health in order to give their baby a chance. So, for instance, sometimes a case is made where a case happens where a cancer is diagnosed during the pregnancy, and the decision has to be made whether to start anti-cancer treatment immediately, which may well damage the baby, And in that situation, often the doctors were saying, yes, to give the mother the best chance, we must start cancer treatment immediately. And the mother saying, no, absolutely no, I'm prepared to take the risk. I want to give my baby the very best chance. And I saw that kind of thing on many occasions, and it made me realize that is a kind of maternal instinct, is if necessary to sacrifice your own health and well-being for the good of your baby. And of course that happens after birth many times, and it's written deep in our parental hearts, and I know that as a father as well. You're prepared to go through any sacrifice because of this precious life that you've been given. So it's interesting that often medical perspectives and the kind of human perspectives, maternal perspectives, are not the same.
Do you think, or how do you think your faith impacted on how you viewed life, but also how you practiced medicine? And actually the reverse, do you think your gift in science and medicine shaped your faith as well?
Yeah, thanks. They're very big questions. I've no doubt that it did. It worked both ways. I have always felt that I needed to be a holistic person. I couldn't live with these different compartments. There's a great temptation to do that, and particularly as a Christian, there's a temptation, that to be a kind of different person on Sunday in the worship service, and we use religious language and we think religious thoughts and all the rest, and then on Monday morning, I go to work in the hospital, and do I just click into a medical mode, and now suddenly my language changes, my thinking changes, my behavior changes? And I always felt that was wrong. There had to be the same person on the Monday morning ward round as I was on the Sunday evening worship service, and that's a real challenge and I think it does have impact both ways. It changes the way you behave on a Monday. It always changes the way you think on a Sunday as well, because God is the God of everything. I mean, one of the wonderful things as a Christian is, and I learned that it was really important as much as possible to pray every day at the beginning of the day, to pray that God would use me and would open doors and opportunities for me. And I tried to make that, I failed many times, but I tried to make that a discipline that every day I would be praying that. And then as I went through the day, I was looking out, where are you, God? What are you going to do today? And sometimes there were just these quite extraordinary experiences when sometimes we're facing some kind of clinical emergency or challenge or whatever, but there was a sense of God's presence and reality, the presence of the Holy Spirit. It made me realize that actually an intensive care unit can be a holy place. It can be just as holy a place as a cathedral or as a church, or that the presence of God, and particularly in his people. While I was working at UCH, it was a privilege that a whole number of the staff were also Christian believers, and that the fact that we were working as a team, sharing these Christian beliefs, it of course it didn't solve all the problems, but there was a sense that we were serving together. And so I think one of the things that I've tried to formulate and pass on to other Christian medical students and so on is that we're called to be Jesus to our patients. We're called to be the hands of Jesus, in however hard that, but also what an amazing privilege to be Jesus to people in enormous distress. But at the same time, we're called to see Jesus in our patients, that actually he is there before us. He is already there. And one of the things that really struck me, and I think this is a particular perspective as a baby doctor, and that is that Jesus too had been a baby, and therefore I found myself reflecting, I wonder how Mary and Joseph treated their newborn baby? I mean, would they have just said, oh, well, it's just a baby, isn't it? Change the nappy, get on with life, sort of thing? Or would you say there would be a kind of reverence, a kind of wonder at this special baby that they've been given? And I realized I had to treat every baby in my care in the same way that Mary and Joseph would have treated their baby, with that same kind of respect and even wonder at the miracle of a new life.
I love that that's where actually you went. I was going to ask you something else, but seeing as how you went to Jesus as a newborn baby and with his mother and father, if I bring in actually then the overlap with obstetrics in one way, because obviously Jesus was Jesus before he was born. So similarly, I think in my own work, that realization, as we've taken time to really dwell on the conception, the incarnation of God, when he came in human form, it began at conception, and he developed in the womb of his mother. They were biologically linked, related. She nurtured him in her womb. And actually, I think we did an event a few years ago, John. You may not remember. It was a seminar at a Christian conference, and it was the first time I'd heard it. And you talked about God's compassion for us. And in Hebrew, the root of the word compassion is the same as the root for the word for womb, rahem, I think. And you were describing then God's compassion for us being like the compassion of and the nurturing of a mother's womb, but then the love of a mother, for her baby. So if we bring that together and again think about medicine, when it comes to your understanding and you're living out that value that the life before birth and after birth is the same and is valued, that in pregnancy before birth, obviously, and then mothering after birth, it continues. There's a mum and a baby, there's bigger than just the results on a graph or on a blood test. It's much more than just facts and figures. How do you think in medicine the Abortion Act in 1967 impacted on how medics viewed the life before birth, but also at birth and just beyond in those sort of neonatal, in that neonatal period?
Yeah, well, and I think the truth is it made an enormous difference, even though, I mean, often, the way the law impacts on attitudes is quite complex and it's not obvious. But it really it changed obstetrics and the whole issues at the beginning of life in a very profound way, because this natural instinct, both of medicine, because the whole history of medicine as it developed in the West is heavily influenced and impregnated by Christian ideas about the special, unique nature of human life. And that's why right from the earliest days, in the Western medical profession, doctors committed themselves to life and only to use their gifts and medical skills to benefit and never to harm. And that is a wonderful tradition which goes all the way back for thousands of years. And so once abortion was legalized and the doctor became, under certain circumstances, the destroyer of life, and was making judgments as to when and whether to destroy a life, that had very profound consequences. And it led to a sort of extraordinary situation which I was confronted with almost on a daily basis in the hospital, because you have these two developments going side by side. So in the neonatal world, which I've was working and heavily committed to, we were becoming more successful in keeping babies alive at 24 weeks, and then at 23 weeks, and then at even 22 weeks. The youngest baby that I cared for that ever survived was 21 weeks and 6 days, and so our whole focus was on these babies having an intrinsic value, and we were prepared to do everything to transport a life. And yet, in the very same hospital, the fetal medicine unit was receiving pregnant women from a wide area of London when some kind of problem with the unborn baby, the fetus, had been detected, and there were a whole series of very sophisticated tests were being carried out. But in cases where there was clearly a risk of significant disability or some other fetal problem, mothers were being offered an abortion, or in later cases what was called a feticide. And because of the way that the law works in the UK, late abortions or feticides were being carried out in my hospital, just one floor away, in mothers where the baby was 26 weeks, 28 weeks, 30 weeks, 32 weeks. And so these two worlds were colliding. And as a consultant neonatologist, I was being asked to go up one floor from the baby unit to go and talk to a pregnant mother who had a problem with the baby. And the obstetricians, the fetal medicine specialists, had said, would you like to talk to a paediatrician about what would happen if you carried on with the pregnancy? And so I was invited to go and talk to a mother, and in many cases this was a sort of heavily pregnant mother, and the baby in her womb was considerably bigger and tougher and stronger than many of the babies we were struggling to save one floor down. And then you said to yourself, and I said to myself, how was it possible in one NHS and in one hospital for these two apparently contradictory things to be going on? You know, both areas of high-tech medicine, but really dedicated to be doing quite contradictory things.
And forgive me if this is a sort of a clumsy question, but it really strikes me. So I know that in the context of abortion, the fetal medicine unit are involved in the later stage terminations. But it was like I heard it for the first time, and I'm thinking, in that context, fetal medicine isn't necessarily medicine to keep the baby alive. And I don't think I'd ever really heard it like that before. And then if the baby is delivered, if mummy continues, it's not that the baby stays with fetal medicine. The baby then comes to neonatology. So, well, that's, maybe I'll just park that thought now that I'm thinking fetal medicine isn't about the fetus.
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, I've often thought that it's a very Orwellian use of language. It's a very manipulative use, because, and it's not entirely the case, that sometimes there are treatments that can be given to the fetus directly, and fetal medicine specialists use very sophisticated techniques to try and preserve the life of the fetus. But in many cases, sadly, the medical techniques are used to destroy the life of a fetus.
And that's stark. Do you know, and I hadn't actually been planning to ask you this, but just recently there have been a couple of stories on the island of Ireland, north and south. In the south of Ireland, it's been in the media being reported upon 108 babies were born alive after failed, in their words, failed terminations. And in Northern Ireland, there was a freedom of information request, and then it was verbally answered in Stormont in our assembly buildings that 32 babies had been born alive after failed abortions. Did you ever have any? There's a lot to unpack there, and we don't know all the details, etc. But just maybe bringing it back to your own experience, were there any cases where you were brought in at that point? Or my understanding is that most often babies are just left to die. Do you know? Can you say anything into that?
Yes, and in fact, I can remember a tragic case many years ago when an abortion procedure was being carried out in the hospital, and the baby came out alive and cried, and the doctor who was carrying out the procedure didn't know what to do and gave the emergency alarm, and the neonatal resuscitation team arrived and started resuscitating the baby. And then it was only after they'd resuscitated the baby they then discovered that this was an abortion procedure, and the baby was very premature and very sick, and I was then called in as the consultant. And I can remember agonizing about what the right thing to do was, but I felt that in this emergency situation the first thing to do was to prioritize the life of the baby, and so we admitted the baby into the intensive care unit. Sadly, it then became apparent that because of the abortion procedure, the baby had been exposed to a very severe shortage of oxygen and was very severely damaged by that process. And then with a heavy heart, I and my colleagues took the decision that the right thing to do was to switch off the life support machinery and allow the baby to die. But it was because of cases like that that the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists then sent round some very grisly advice for doctors who were doing abortions, where they said that the doctors who were doing the abortions had to ensure that the unborn baby was dead before the delivery, and that this led on to the technique which is often used now, where doctors will inject a lethal poison directly into the heart of the fetus.
Does it surprise you that it still happens then, that babies are born alive after you have, as you said, that grisly sort of instruction, and feticide is meant to be performed uninsured?
The problem, I mean, there are many, it's all very grisly, I'm afraid, Dawn, but the truth is that it's a highly sophisticated and technologically skilled procedure to be able to get this lethal poison into the baby's heart. And unless you are a highly trained specialist fetal medicine doctor, you can't do it. And so, because there are not access to this kind of highly trained specialist on the island of Ireland, I would guess that's the reason that the particular technological skill is not available. But it is a very grisly topic, and it just points out this collision between these two ways of thinking, and this collision is enshrined in the law. So until the moment of birth, the unborn baby in our law does not have a recognizable legal personality, an identity, and therefore it doesn't have legal protection. At the very moment of birth, and the law says it's when the body of the baby is fully delivered from the body of the mother, at that point the baby has full legal rights. The baby is uniquely a unique individual. Everything must be done to protect this individual life. Any action taken to end the life of the baby is homicide, and it all happens at this collision at the moment of birth. And many people have argued this doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
We could keep talking about, I mean, there's so much to talk about there, but if we sort of move it into where ethics, medicine, faith and theology all meet, because that's where, I suppose, when I first came across you, it was in that world. It wasn't through sort of being a patient or knowing somebody that had been a patient of yours. So how did you increasingly move into this space of practicing medicine, but speaking into the ethics of it from a faith perspective. How did it happen for you?
Well, it certainly wasn't planned, but as I've already said, I did have this very strong sense of a call that medicine was not just a job, that God had put me in this position for a reason and a purpose, and my calling was to try to be faithful in the position that I've been put into. And as I said, I went into neonatology, really was drawn to it, but without really recognizing the kind of ethical challenges it was going to throw up. And it was only as I worked in the area and became increasingly senior and felt I just had an overwhelming conviction that this was what I'd been called to do, and that I had to therefore try to work out what it meant to work as a Christian who was committed to serve Christ, and who'd been placed in this very unusual situation. And it ended up, with me sometimes having to take fairly uncomfortable positions and stand out and cause, sometimes leading to controversies and difficulties. But and I'm not naturally a kind of a polemical kind of person. My instincts are not to. I'm not a very courageous person, but I just felt on a whole number of occasions that there was no option but to stand up and to give a voice for the voiceless. That was what I was asked to do, and so that led on to a whole number of things in the public square, being involved in public debates with pro-abortion campaigners. In particular, one very prominent pro-abortion campaigner I got to know quite personally. In fact, she became almost a friend, and we discovered that even though we differed radically on what we thought was right and wrong, we could actually have a sort of conversation. We could respect one another's views and listen carefully and put our own positions. And so I did a number of public debates with her, and I hope we modelled a way of talking about these issues without just, I'm afraid, what often happens, which is just a kind of hurling insults at one another. I gave evidence in Parliament on a number of occasions to parliamentary committees and so on, and got involved in public media. Again, all that was rather a surprise.
I was going to ask, did you enjoy it at all at any level?
I think enjoy is not the right word.
No.
It was a privilege, I mean, to do things like the Today programme, on Radio 4, is extraordinary because it's all done live. And you're sitting in this little studio, and then all of a sudden, they tell you, well, the listening audience is sort of 6 million.
You try not to think about that.
And I also discovered that they have this green room where the people who are about to go on to that particular slot talk together, and often you meet people who are sort of technically your opponents, people who have very different views. And I discovered the green room becomes a kind of confessional. I think it's something to do with the adrenaline of the thing.
Well, we'll not ask you to break the confessional space, John. But actually, then, I can imagine and it's wonderful that you're modelling, and certainly being part of the Evangelical Alliance, modelling how you disagree well, modelling what reasoned and reasonable looks like. I can sort of empathise with you there. But I can also picture whenever that didn't happen, when there were areas of conflict or confrontation. But what did that look like in the church? Did you get any pushback from within the church where you would feel that you would be supported and there would be people that would stand with you in the life space? What what did conflict look like there potentially?
Yes, I was extremely grateful for the support I got from some of my Christian friends who, were aware of the fact that sometimes I was taking a stance in public which was getting pushback. There was one particular occasion when I gave evidence for Parliament, which was about the scientific basis for the Abortion Act. This is a number of years ago. And I just presented the evidence about the survival of our very premature babies, which was my specialist area. And, this was my scientific area. But rather to my surprise, there was an almost immediate media pushback. And I was being accused of being deliberately manipulating the figures because I was a Christian and purveying falsehoods and misusing my position as an academic. And I was even then accused to the head of the university. I was hauled into the presence of the head of the university because a senior politician had said that I was abusing my position, and it was very, very frightening and concerning. But and it was at that moment I really discovered you discover who your friends are, and particularly some close Christian friends who were really aware of all this and were praying and supporting. And actually, when the discussing it with the head of the university, he said, he said, "I can see this is all politically motivated, and we will back you."
That's a relief.
They came out with a press release saying that they supported my right as an academic to portray the evidence that I was aware of. But yes, it was a very stressful period, and there have been that moments when it suddenly blows up. What I've learned is that these things can just happen almost instantaneously. The power of the media when something blows up. But of course, within the next 48 hours, it had all moved on, and something else suddenly.
That's when you're grateful for a quick news cycle. What about within people who saw that? Not even those who were walking it with you, but maybe people who were looking on. It must have had an impact on some others who would rather keep their head down, although you didn't look to be that person. What would you say to younger Christian medics, maybe now, who are looking to go into certain fields of medicine where there could be, and it's not just this area of medicine, but there would be and a clash potentially, or areas of conflict? How would you encourage them to be that image bearer and that aroma bringer into their space?
Yeah, it is something that I have talked to with other Christian doctors and with medical students and so on. I think it is about this daily trying to be daily grounded, trying this discipline of every day, presenting myself to the Lord and saying, I want to be used by you. I want to be usable in your service. I want to be faithful. And then trusting him to use us as he wishes. And we don't court trouble. We don't court controversy. We try to be a reasonable and rational and a peacemaker, but I think that inevitably there will be times when we have to stand up, particularly for truth. And it's particularly when it's not standing up for myself, it's standing up for those who don't have a voice. That was where I felt motivated. It was not really about protecting my own interests as a doctor or whatever, but that I was in a position where I had been given a voice which I could use for the voiceless. And that does seem to be a very important calling. And Christians in not so many areas have been the voices for the voiceless. And it's interesting because in the sort of, as you well know, the public debate about abortion is so often polarized into these two camps. You're either pro-choice or you're pro-life. And what I discovered was, as a baby doctor, I was actually quite difficult to caricature, or and if people are saying, well, why on earth are you protecting, and speaking out for babies? And well, that's my job. That's what I'm employed to do. So it was like I was able to come in from left field sometimes, in these very polarized debates, and I think that many parents were able to see that and recognize that they wouldn't want to call themselves pro-choice or pro-life, but they would see how protecting and defending the vulnerable was something that we are called to do.
And it's hard for anyone to criticize a doctor who's speaking up for a baby until you, or unless you, deny that there is a baby. But with you being brought in at the point of birth as well, the baby is now here. So you were in like this perfect place, and you were speaking with experience. Do you miss it, John? Do you miss actually practicing medicine?
I don't. The honest truth is that it was wonderful when I was doing it. I miss the teamwork. I miss, there were some particularly, as I said, poignant but wonderful experiences. I miss that. It's also, though, an extraordinarily stressful kind of medicine, and I don't miss the fact that I can go to bed and know that I'm unlikely to be hauled out of my bed at 3 o'clock in the morning with some terrible life catastrophe. And the level of stress, you do tend to live at this roller coaster ride between absolutely wonderful, extraordinary things and then absolute catastrophes. And it's quite nice to just have a normal, a more normal lifestyle, and I'm really enjoying being a grandparent and having the privilege of sharing. I still love being with children, and one of the very moving things that happens from time to time is that babies that I cared for, who are now adults or their parents are, I get contact from time to time from people with whom I knew as a baby, and telling me about what's been going on in their lives and so on, and that is extraordinarily rewarding and wonderful.
That's so lovely. And as we sort of think about drawing this to a close, and I'm thinking about, at this end of your career, you're surrounded by, it talks in scripture about being surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, but you have, like, in this sense, you have witnesses surrounding you, mummies and babies and families, for whom your care ensured their life and well-being. And that's just wonderful. As we think about them and maybe the church space, everything that we've talked about, and from this perspective, with all those years, John, behind you, and as you're mindful of the shaping of medicine because of legislation, I know you keep your hand in, and I'm sure you're looking ahead to maybe some of the trajectories that we are on. How can you bring your vast experience and the faith that you have that brings value to life, how can you bring that to bear as you look forward and imagine better for both lives in pregnancy?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think immediately my focus goes on encouraging the next generation of carers. One of the sad things that's happened is that a number of Christian people who do feel called into medicine, doctors, nurses, midwives, therapists, and so on, there's a tendency to avoid these fields, to avoid the field of obstetrics, midwifery, neonatology, because they're seen as too ethically challenged and too difficult, and therefore Christians tend to go into other areas where there are less direct ethical challenges. And I think that's very sad. I'm immensely grateful that I ended up in this field, even if it was largely by accident, but it was by God's overruling. And so I think one of the things is to really encourage and pray that God would bring the next generation of Christian carers who have both a vision of a Christian vision of the motherly father, the father of the God of compassion who cares, and also the God who turned himself into this tiny little fetus and an embryo and a newborn baby and so on. That they would, but at the same time they would want to develop the professional skills to be able to be the hands of Jesus in a professional area. I actually think that there may well be some reckoning coming down the line. The whole question of whether assisted suicide, some kind of euthanasia, is going to be legalized is an open question. Although it may well be that this particular law that's currently going through Parliament is going to not be passed, and for which I'm extremely grateful if that's the case. Nonetheless, I think it will be continuingly to come back, and therefore I think that unless the most extraordinary miracle happens, I do think that some form of assisted suicide legislation may come into the National Health Service here in the UK. And I think that may well be a kind of watershed moment. And I think it may be possible to start thinking about creating alternative health facilities which did actually reflect a Christian understanding of the value of life. Because I think it may be possible that increasingly Christian practitioners will feel they simply cannot work within a system where the suicide of patients is happening and being encouraged and so on. Mm. And so paradoxically, I do foresee that at some point in the future there will be the development of a new independent health facilities that will be particularly able to put into practice Christian principles right from pregnancy all the way through to death. And I think that if such a health facility start to become available, I suspect the great British public would be extremely interested and will beat a pathway to the door. And in some ways it will be the recreating of the old hospitals which did have a very strong Christian foundation. So that I don't know what the future will hold. I know that God uses us where we are. He uses us to be a witness, and the most important thing I think is wherever we are, that we are trying and praying to be the hands of Jesus, giving hope and protection and valuing life, because life is precious.
I love that, John. And whether it's within or out with the NHS, a healthcare facility and service that values life is surely something that nobody would want to argue with. Thank you for your time today. It is so much appreciated.
Thanks so much, Dawn. It's been great to be here.
Hello and welcome to the part of the episode where we take on your questions and comments and we look at cultural news stories through a pro-both lens. Now, this episode is going out a little bit later than scheduled due to something monumental that happened in the House of Lords last night, but we're going to get onto that in a moment. Now, we are out and about all the time talking all things both lives in a variety of spaces to all ages and stages. It's something that we absolutely love getting out and doing. And last night we were doing a talk, and one of the things we love most during a talk is the Q&A session at the end. We love that interaction and being able to take your questions. And we have a question from one of our listeners that actually ties in really well. And it's a two-parter for you, Dawn. The first part is, when we're out doing talks, is there a most frequently asked question? And the second part is, has that most frequently asked question changed over the past few years?
There are probably a few questions that always come up. One of those is just a reaction to the stats. We always talk about the UK and, if we're in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland statistics on abortion. And often people are surprised at the prevalence of abortion. Last night, a question was asked about the rise in abortion rates here in Northern Ireland. They've tripled since the law was changed in 2019-20, but across in England and Wales, it's the highest recorded number of abortions since the abortion law changed nearly 60 years ago. So the question was asked, how and why have we got to this stage where nearly 300,000 abortions have happened in the most recent year? And actually connecting it to why this episode is dropping slightly later, we were last night, as you said, doing our talk, but in Westminster, they were voting on what is the most significant law change since 1967 to abortion legislation. And I think if I merge those two things together, we said last night, it's been the decades worth of cultural normalization of abortion, so that for so many people, it's seen as no big deal. Recently, we heard of a young teenage girl who described it like getting a tooth out. That's all abortion is. And actually, in law, what it reminded me of is the declaration, the preamble to the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. So if we think over here, we have abortion legislation that has normalized the dehumanization of unborn children. But the Declaration on the Rights of the Child talks about the child by reason of their physical and mental immaturity needing special safeguards and care, including appropriate legal protection before as well as after birth. Now, that Declaration on the Rights of the Child is completely counter to the current legal status of children in the UK based on last night's vote. So last night in the House of Lords, the full decriminalisation of abortion, self-induced abortion by a woman, was supported, which means that a woman can self-induce her own abortion at any stage of pregnancy right up until the point of birth, and will face no criminal sanction for doing so. Now, what does appropriate legal protection for unborn children look like when now our Parliament in Westminster has basically given unborn children the status of property? That's all they are. They're non-humans, effectively, in law, because a woman can regard her own unborn child as her property to do with what she wills, dispose of it as she wants. We've opened the door to legalising infanticide in the UK. There is no appropriate legal protection when it comes to a woman and her child because of nearly 60 years of messaging that have said non-person, non-child, non-human, clump of cells, not a baby yet until they're born. And when law says that a human being isn't a human being, not a person, and not worthy of protection, we get to the point now where abortion has become so normalized. It's like getting a tooth out, removing a mole, removing a bunion, having an appendectomy. And comments like that have been said at our Supreme Court, effectively in Parliament, by those who set cultural values and laws in the UK. And frankly, we went to bed seeing the vote. We talked about it. We nearly expected it. We've woken up feeling appalled, horrified, looking at cultural commentary, people using words like evil, repugnant, abhorrent, nauseous. And we think, how did we get to that stage? And it's because it's been tolerated that abortion has been talked about as healthcare. How is it healthcare to terminate a human life? How is it healthcare to deny the harms of abortion? We actually heard in Parliament, and I know I'm going on a bit of a rant here, we actually heard in Parliament Lords, can I use the word lying? Misrepresenting what's happening, talking as if there is no evidence that abortion laws and processes that are currently in place, not even this complete decriminalisation, talking about them as if there's no evidence of abuse. There's no evidence of linking current practices, particularly pills by post, to human trafficking, sexual exploitation and child abuse. There is evidence, but too many parliamentarians are sticking their fingers in their ears, covering their eyes like the little monkeys, hear no evil, see no evil, but actually, because they're not hearing it or seeing it, now they're doing it, and it's horrendous.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the key standout quotes for me last night, and I'm paraphrasing, was whenever someone said in their speech that if abortion is simply healthcare, then why are we talking about it like this? Why is it being debated in the House of Commons or in the House of Lords? If it's just healthcare, then why does it need to go to the highest levels of debate in this country? So we know that a vote took place last night in the House of Lords, but what are the next steps? So abortion hasn't been decriminalised in practice yet. So what are the next steps for our listeners?
I think there's another stage in the Lords, and then it will go back to the House of Commons, and then it receives royal assent unless something happens, which is highly unlikely, and then it will become law. I think for us, we'll continue to engage as both lives, back to where we started, engaging with the public, engaging with family members, talking about legislation, talking about the impact of legislation and culture, imagining better, which is what we always try and do with our guests. And actually, the conversation that we've just had with Professor Wyatt ended with, how can we imagine better? And we were talking about cultural transformation. And in relation to probably the assisted dying conversation, John talked about what would it look like to have an alternative healthcare service based on Christian values that actually value every image bearer. So if we connect that to this, is it time to talk about an alternative healthcare provider that will, based on Christian values, value both lives in pregnancy, before and after birth, that will maybe help counter the decline in maternity services that everybody's talking about, but too many people aren't connecting that to the fact that the Royal Colleges who provide maternity care are the ones who now are supportive of the complete dehumanization of their tiniest patient. I think there has to be a connection there. And actually, John talked about fetal medicine and fetal medicine not being about the fetus. The vast majority of women, if we take repeat abortions into account, the vast majority of women, nearly only 1 in 5, put it this way, 1 in 5 women will have an abortion based on taking the repeat abortions into account. So the vast majority of women won't have an abortion, but for the sake of abortion rights, their unborn child who is wanted and loved has been completely dehumanized. I think there has to be a connection with maternity care to how we're valuing or not the unborn patient. So I think it's time to look again at healthcare in the UK.
Absolutely. And this is a story that we will be following really closely. So sign up to our newsletter, keep an eye on our social media, and we will be providing you with updates as and when they occur. And the thing is we did, like you said, we did wake up to a lot of pushback in the media this morning, even people who are really pro-choice saying, actually, this has gone too far. But there will be some people who are celebrating last night's results. And it used to be that people were celebrating access to abortion. So they may have said, it's not something that I would do personally, but I support a woman's right to choose. They were celebrating the access to it, but maybe not the act itself. But we've seen a shift in the tone of the conversation where people are now actually celebrating the act of abortion itself. And an example that we saw of this recently was actually at a Zara Larsson concert. So Zara Larsson, for anybody who doesn't know, is probably one of the biggest pop stars in the world. She was quite big 10 years ago, and she's had like a big resurgence since, and she's been on a huge tour. So she has a massive platform. She has millions of people hanging on her every word, and so she's using her influence, unfortunately, to say that both lives don't matter. And this was seen really poignantly when she has this one of her biggest songs is called Midnight Sun. And someone who had attended one of her concerts posted a video of Zara singing this song and captioned the video by saying, "I didn't realize I was pregnant when this video was being taken, but I'm so glad that my unborn baby got to hear Midnight Sun before I aborted it." The Zara's fan posted this online, and Zara actually saw this and responded with, "I killed the performance and then you killed it after." And this sparked huge backlash online. People were genuinely disgusted that this had been said. This is someone who has immense influence, especially over her demographic of fans, which are majority younger women. And all I couldn't help but think was, if you are a woman facing a pregnancy crisis and you're not sure what to do, you really don't feel supported, you feel like abortion is maybe your best or your only option, and then an artist that you really look up to, that really influences your thinking on things, is saying something like that, it's like, I don't know if she realizes the power of those words. But like I said, there was a lot of backlash online, and it's been really interesting when we've been out doing talks and we use that example, you can hear a pin drop in the room because it's so stark. And like I said, it's just really disappointing to see a young artist using her platform to promote such a vile message.
Yeah, and you don't kill a tooth. You don't kill a mole. I think it reveals that despite the euphemisms that are used, everybody knows what an abortion is and does. They know that when they're pregnant, that means there's an unborn child that you're expecting. So when they use words like killing, they know that there's a life that's being terminated. And as you say, culture is now celebrating the act. Mm-hmm. The vote in Parliament last night effectively did the same. Mm-hmm. And it's truly shocking.
Yeah. So looking forward to our next episode, we know that there's going to be even more conversations around decriminalisation. This isn't a conversation that's going away anytime soon. But what can our listeners and viewers expect from the next episode? Who are you talking to next on?
So in the next episode, we are excited to be talking with our lovely colleague, Alicia Edmond, who's the head of public policy for the Evangelical Alliance. So we'll be talking with her about her journey from being a pro-choice Christian to a pro-life, pro-both Christian, and looking at the policy world that she leads on in the UK for the Evangelical Alliance, connecting that to the life space. So we'll be talking more about the vote last night as well.
Brilliant. And if you have any questions or comments that you would like to share with us, then please do get in touch. All the details will be in the show notes. But we really would love to hear from you. So as ever, you can find us on social media, you can subscribe to our newsletter, and we will see you next time.